Welcome to Africa Today TV. I'm Tara Wall, an authoritative voice on U.S.-Africa relations, ambassador to Senegal, and former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under President George H.W. Bush, Herman Cohen. Ambassador Cohen, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Can you tell us a little bit about your previous roles in previous administrations, the importance of U.S.-Africa relations, and the state of those relations as you see it today?
Well, I'm in the generation that started out with Africa becoming independent. I was a junior diplomat in the 1960s, and all these countries were becoming independent. So I said, this is going to be great. Let me get into that game. And I volunteered to serve in Africa, and I served in 5 countries, ending up as ambassador to Senegal, and I enjoyed it all. And it was interesting to see how they were evolving toward eliminating poverty, toward development, toward building up their economies, and how they were evolving politically. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not been smooth sailing. Sure.
Well, yeah, and if you contrast from when you started, the relations then between, I guess, the relations and the development over time now, how have you seen that progressed?
Well, one thing that was very important back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was the first president to deal with African policy, because all these countries were becoming independent when he was president. And he said, we're not going to bring the Cold War to Africa. And that was a great decision because, you know, we were in the midst of this war with Russia, the Soviet Union. And we could have said, you're either with us or with the Soviet Union. But he said, no, let them be neutral. Let them decide they're independent. We're not going to try to capture them or what have you. So from that point on, relations have been very smooth. We always honored their sovereignty, whether they were small countries or large countries. We send ambassadors to every country. President Kennedy started the Peace Corps that was extremely popular in Africa. We sent teachers to East Africa, I remember at the beginning. And then we had the great Kenya airlift in the 1960s, and guess who was on that? President Obama's father. And he was sent to the University of Hawaii, where he met President Obama's mother. So our activities were always abundant, and our relations with Africa, I could say, never had any low points. It was always very smooth, very friendly, because the Africans understood that we were not trying to make them pro-American or try to put them in our orbit. Chambers of Commerce are organized when U.S. companies are there, you see, because I was the U.S. ambassador in Senegal a few years ago, and we had a U.S. Senegalese Chamber of Commerce because we had IBM, we had all sorts of U.S. companies there. So they got together. Well, I was the one who brought them together, and they said, hey, let's make a Chamber of Commerce here, and they all loved the idea, you see. But if you don't have U.S. companies, you're not going to get chambers of commerce. The World Bank says that there's $100 billion of African money that's sitting outside.
Wow.
That's unacceptable. They should be investing it at home. Yeah, well, let's get some new things in there that'll really make Africa move. And there are 2 things. One is electric power, because as I said before, you can't do anything without it.
Sure.
And the other thing is extremely important is agriculture, because the majority of Africans live in the rural areas, and they are very primitive in how they produce food. So there has to be investments in roads to the markets, in storage facilities, in fertilizer, and in technology, tractors, and that sort of thing.
And I guess at that point, too, is when you can start talking more robustly about trade as well.
Right.
And trading back and forth with
When I started out in Africa in the early days, they were a powerhouse in agriculture. They produced more corn, more palm oil, more pineapples than anybody in the world.
And what happened in your view?
Well, they discovered oil, and all of a sudden everyone flocked to the cities, and they gave up. So most people in rural areas, I remember visiting the president of Tanzania, and he said, you taught us how to produce cotton, and we had a bumper crop. But it's rotting on the farms because we don't have roads to take them to the ports. And that sort of thing. Well, I was working directly for President Reagan. I was in the White House with him, and I was Assistant Secretary of State for Bush Sr. And they received these African leaders one-on-one. They came to Washington, they had lunch, and then they had a nice discussion. I'd like to see more of that, you see. But having a summit meeting, say, as symbolic that we love Africa, let's do it once every 5 years like the Japanese. I think that would be a good idea.
Well, also some would say that the U.S. seems that obsessed with China's growing influence in Africa.
I haven't heard a single American official tell me that China is hurting U.S. interests. Nobody has said that. They say, well, they're building roads, they're building dams, that's great. You know, why should we be worried about China? And they're trading, they're buying African goods. In fact, there's a growing middle class now in Africa, people who have money to spend beside for food, that comes from investments in mining and in oil that the Chinese are doing. So there's nothing wrong with the Chinese. What I'm telling the Africans, you've got to manage the Chinese because they're taking advantage of you. For example, they bring their own workers. Why should they bring their own workers? There are plenty of African workers. And when they do hire Africans, they don't treat them right. I was teaching over at Johns Hopkins, and one of my students went to Africa to study the Chinese. And she asked the Chinese managers, why are you treating these African workers so poorly? And he said, we're treating them just like we treat our own workers in China. So the Africans have to manage them. And also, they're bringing in a lot of people who do retail. There's no reason to allow them to come in. But that's not our problem. That's the Africans' problem, you see. But they're not hurting U.S. interests.
Yeah, well, someone said, and some have also argued there's a sense that in Africa, China buys natural resources, builds infrastructures, offers seemingly cheap loans, but doesn't interfere with the domestic affairs of Africa. But on the flip end, you know, it puts the U.S. at a disadvantage because it's perceived sometimes as being too intrusive in lecturing African countries on human rights and democracy. Do you see that dichotomy there?
Not really. I don't think we do too much lecturing.
No?
No, we do it in really egregious cases, you know, like Mugabe, a few others, you know, like Sudan. But one of the best professors I've ever had on Africa, he says, you know, when we deal with Africa, if your economics are good, you get a waiver on democracy. So countries like Rwanda, which are very authoritarian, totalitarian, their economy is excellent, so we treat them nicely.
Well, AFRICOM, U.S.'s military command for Africa, which is based in Stuttgart, Germany, tried to establish itself in Africa, but African countries resisted hosting the military command. What, in your view, motivated African nations not to host AFRICOM on their soil?
Well, this goes back to the beginning of African independence. I remember reading the archives. President Eisenhower said, we will not have NATO forces in Africa. If there is instability, if there is civil war, let the UN do it, you know, with African troops. We don't want to be imperialistic and have American troops. So you won't find, the only country that has bases in Africa from Europe is France. And they've had very close relations with their former colonies. And these former colonies have wanted the French to be there. And when I was ambassador in Senegal, I remember visiting the army base there, the Senegalese army, and there I saw Frenchmen in Senegalese uniforms. So there are very close relations. But the others should not be coming in. They should not have what European forces or American forces in Africa. It's too imperialistic.
Well, so, okay. Well, there is some insecurity that's grown in the Sahara region of Africa, specifically in Libya, Algeria, Mali, and Niger since the demise of Colonel Gaddafi. Sectarian violence has now reached Kenya and Central African Republic. Do you think that the West opened a Pandora's box, in your view, in Africa by removing Gaddafi?
They had to take care of Gaddafi because there was an Arab Spring starting up in eastern Libya. And he had African mercenary soldiers. He didn't trust his own people to have an army, so he brought in Africans from Mali and Niger. And he was sending them to the eastern part of Libya to really kill everyone. He said, I'm going to kill everyone. I don't accept this Arab Spring in your demonstration. So we had to stop him from doing that, which NATO did, the Americans, the British, the French. But they had to follow up, which they didn't do. Gaddafi was gone. Okay, thanks, we're happy. Follow up, secure the arms depots. Make sure that that city of Tripoli is stabilized. We just let it go. You see, now arms are flowing from Gaddafi's arms depots down into the Sahel, down into Mali, down into Niger, and this is a very dangerous situation.
And what, in your view, how do we go forward in addressing some of these security issues, concerns? And in your view, what are some next steps to help?
Well,
shore
the
up
Africans
security?
need training and they need material, and I think AFRICOM is supplying that. AFRICOM is not going to send U.S. troops to fight.
Right.
They cannot do that.
Right.
But they are training, and they have special forces in various countries. We do have some people in Chad in order to help Nigeria against this terrorist group, Boko Haram, but it's very modest. The thing to do is train and arm the Africans so that they can handle this problem by themselves.
What is your view about what happened in Boko Haram and how that's been handled overall?
It's a long story, but it starts with Nigerian corruption. There's a lot of corruption in the army and in the political levels of Nigeria, and in these northern provinces of Nigeria, which are all Muslims. They treated some of these young people badly, and the people who were doing this were Western-educated Nigerians. People who had been to university. They became governors. They became high officials in these various states up in northern Nigeria. And they exploited these young people, and these young people got angry. We've worked for you, and you're not paying us, you're not giving us education. So they started an organization about 10 years ago called Western Education is Bad, because these Western-educated Nigerians were exploiting Nigerian young people who never had education. And the Nigerians treated them very badly. Human rights violations took place. So these people were radicalized, and it started building and building until you got into something very radical, extremely radical, called Boko Haram, and they're having a hard time dealing with it.
What, in your view, would you say is a takeaway that Americans should take away about their view, their vision of Africa? What are your kind of recommendations, and how your dealings have been there, kind of another bigger, broader picture, if you will, of Africa in general?
Well, first of all, we have to have a mindset change. Our mindset has always been Africa is a charity case, humanitarian aid. That's what they deserve. But my experience in Africa, I lived there 12 years, is Africans are as capable of doing economic growth and development as any other people, just given the right incentives and the right assistance. So therefore, if we can help the African leaders create an environment where Africans can invest some of their money, bring it back from abroad, and feel safe doing that, where they can enforce contracts, the Africans will move ahead on their own, really. The farmers are terrific.
And there are areas that are thriving, that are prospering, that people do well, that businesses are, doing well.
Even Nigeria, with all its corruption, has some wonderful private sector people. But I'm really hoping the farmers get a break.
Sure.
They work hard, the women as well as the men, and if they can get some infrastructure and some technical assistance, how was the U.S. agriculture built up? We had the farm assistance from the U.S. government, people spreading out all over the United States. Look, this is the seeds you need. This is the fertilizer you need. The African farmer will just burst out with wealth.
Yeah. Well, finally, let me ask, Ambassador, in hindsight, what would you say would be your greatest achievement and your deepest regret as the premier of a U.S. diplomat for Africa?
Well, when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, I spent most of my time in conflict resolution. And solving some of these wars was such tremendous satisfaction for me. Ethiopian War, the Mozambique War, just going down there and having all these heads of state signing peace treaties, things that I and my team helped bring about.
Oh, sure.
It was really a great sense of satisfaction. Disappointments, well, some of these deals that I worked out broke down later. For example, the Angolan peace treaty that we did in May of 1991, 3 years later broke down and they went back to war. And I was heartbroken because we worked so hard to bring that about.
Well, we certainly appreciate you stopping in today and sharing. I mean, you're just so well decorated, and I wish you lots of luck for the future and going forward in this.
It was a pleasure for me.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today, and I would once again like to thank my guest, Ambassador Herman Cohen, for his insight and his depth concerning African affairs. Until next time, I'm Tara Wall for Africa Today TV.